So, this is Unit 2, Lesson 3 in American Government, and this lesson is about the Constitution. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the outline of the Constitution and then some of the major clauses that have caused controversy over the years. So, the first thing to understand is that the Constitution is divided up into 7 articles, and they're listed here. And if you have the handout for this lesson, then you should be filling in. You should fill this in based on this. So you could go ahead and pause the video and fill it in. Now, a couple of things just to mention. You'll notice in Article 3 that the judicial branch is set up in Article 3, but the Supreme Court is not clarified. It's not a lot of details given. So today there are 9 people on the Supreme Court, but that actually was decided in later laws that were passed. The Constitution, by the time they got to Article 3, it was almost like they kind of ran out of steam, and they didn't have a lot of detail about the judicial branch. Now, let's talk a little bit. So first of all, you got to understand that the Constitution is divided up into articles. There's 7 articles. Many of those articles are divided into sections. So in Article 1, for instance, there are 10 sections. Article 1 is the longest section in the Constitution, the largest portion. The clauses are then underneath the section, and our textbook numbers the clauses, which is very helpful to us as we're trying to look through the information. But if you look at the actual original document, they did not number the sections like our textbook and many online documents do. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Commerce Clause. Now, what is the connection between the Affordable Health Care Act, which is colloquially known as Obamacare, and the interstate system? You're like, well, I don't know. Well, the answer is they were both justified by the Commerce Clause. So in Article 1, Section 8, there's this phrase that says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. Now, that phrase, if you just read it and say, okay, what does this mean? Probably the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh, it just means that the government, the Congress, can make laws about trade. It can make laws about trade between foreign nations, between states, between Indian tribes. Well, that's true. That's what it means. But this clause has been stretched. That's why it's controversial. It's been stretched. And now the Commerce Clause is used to justify any regulation of government or of business. So you need to write that down. What's the controversy? The controversy is any regulation of business has now said, okay, because of the Commerce Clause, we can regulate you. Now, this is one of those things where it's like, okay, did the Congress mean to, did our founding fathers mean that they should regulate all business? Well, I don't know, but we know that now it has been stretched to mean that. Okay. Another one that's been stretched and is very controversial is the Necessary and Proper Clause. You can read it here, but basically it's saying that the Congress has power to make laws that are necessary and proper to do the things that they're supposed to do. So there are 17 powers listed in the Constitution. And they say, okay, any of those, if you need to make an extra law to carry out that power, you can do so. The Necessary and Proper Clause was a big controversy when the Constitution was first written. It was part of the ratification debate. So the Anti-Federalists, remember, were the people who thought that it would give too much too much power to the federal government. These were the people who were against the Constitution. The Federalists were for the Constitution. So the Federalists said, no, you've got to have this elastic clause in order for government to be efficient. And I do want to mention, please watch the other video. There's a video about these clauses that go into more detail that I want you to watch. The Necessary and Proper Clause was finally decided in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. The McCulloch versus Maryland decision decided that it was okay to use the Necessary and Proper Clause to set up a bank. Okay. And so it's been stretched since then. Another big one was the Louisiana Purchase. The United States government used the Elastic Clause to purchase Louisiana. All right, so the faithful execution clause is another big one. If you look at the words of this clause, it just says that he, talking about the president, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed and shall commission all the officers of the United States. What does that mean? If you actually just look at the text, it just means that he cannot suspend laws. In other words, he can't stop laws, but he can choose how to enforce them. He also has the power to be the federal boss, the ultimate boss of all the federal workers. And here's the controversial part, okay? And when you're figuring out, what do I put in this box? What's controversial? The controversial part is that he can make executive orders. He can make executive orders. What are executive orders? Well, executive orders are when the President of the United States just makes a decision, just decides it, and writes a piece of paper that says everybody needs to do this. An executive order has the power of a law. It has the force of a law, but it doesn't, it's not actually a true law. It can be overturned by a judge. So every president since George Washington has done executive orders, okay? All right, another controversial one is the pardon clause. He shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons. So this means that the President of the United States, okay, what does it mean? It means the President of the United States can pardon anyone. And we talked about this in class. Anyone can be pardoned. The president can decide, I'm going to pardon you. They're free. So there have been many controversial pardons in our history. The first most controversial was when President Ford pardoned Nixon. Ford was Nixon's vice president. And so when Nixon resigned, Ford took over. And Ford pardoned essentially his friend. And of course, that was extremely controversial because people were like, no, Nixon needs to stand for his crimes. But he did not. Another controversial one, we talked about this in class, was somebody that Obama, this is a more recent pardon. He actually commuted the sentence of this person, this individual who had leaked classified government information. But it was controversial because the person is transgender. And so there was this big question is he only getting pardoned because of their gender, so it was a big controversy there. Another big one was when Bill Clinton pardoned his brother for drug crimes. So it can be controversial because it can feel unfair, but the president does have power to do it. All right, full faith and credit clause. This is in Article 4, Section 1. Basically, the full faith and credit clause just says that any decision made in one state carries into another state, okay? Marriage licenses, all that kind of thing. This can be controversial only if states don't agree. So, for instance, the picture down here of the license to carry a handgun. Okay, if you've got a license in one state, why can't you carry it into the other state? And so this can be controversial because different states have different rules. Obviously, before the Supreme Court ruled on same-sex marriage, this was also controversial because it was like, all right, one state says you're married, but the next state says you're not. Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2, it's just saying that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it gives the federal government supremacy. How is this controversial? Well, it's controversial only if the states rebel against the federal government. And this is a classic example here. This is during the Civil Rights Movement when the governor of Alabama refused to segregate schools. And so this guy right here is an envoy of the federal government. He's coming in saying, you will bring these African-American children into the school. And this guy's saying, no, I will not. And obviously this was a huge showdown. Who won that fight? The federal government. Okay, the federal government brought in the National Guard and said, no, you are going to segregate. They did that in Alabama and in Mississippi. Okay, so this is just kind of an overview of some main clauses that are controversial in our Constitution.